WEFUNK. We funk.
Another big passing, however, in the world of music, but one of the true legendary, and as well, I'm sure Puff Daddy broken up about this one as well. However, a little bit more mainstream, being really one of the most influential figures, really, ever in the history of American music in a lot of ways. But of course, I speak of the innovator, the originator, and the architect of rock and roll, of course, Little Richard, and those were all his own nicknames, all right? He came to the table with those nicknames, so those were not my clever takes on Little Richard's influence. But when you come to the table with nicknames of the innovator and the originator, and as well as the architect of rock and roll, you obviously have really made a tremendous mark on the history of music, especially like I mentioned here in America. I guess obviously, just all of those nicknames kind of indicating, his influence really came kind of as, rhythm and blues shifted into kind of what's more, contemporary thought of as rock and roll. And I guess I did talk a little bit about it last month on the Studios thing, and I actually did catch some heat on email talking about the $1 Million Quartet being the that $1 Million Quartet jam really being the birthplace of rock and roll. I mean, that was first of all, I was quoting the movie, right? That was the movie's take on things, right? And as well, that was like the Sun Records story, as I was talking about cool shit that happened in Sun Record for that 2 minutes. But I guess there was, of course, that's one side of the story. I guess the other side of the story was that Little Richard and several other artists already had that shit going on before the white people took it, and then it became thought of as rock and roll. But Little Richard was obviously doing it first. And, of course, Little Richard, his other, I guess, main big influence being, of course, his work on the piano, his rock and roll piano, as opposed to the guitar, which, of course, was a whole different sound and dimension. But, his influence was definitely huge on some of those other influential people as well, like Elvis, and really everybody in the $1 Million Quartet, but especially Elvis really looked at Little Richard as a big influence on their career. Other people who claim to have been, deeply influenced by Little Richard, but a little band named the Beatles, who actually opened for Little Richard's in, early 60s England, and, have always talked and referred to Little Richard as, their, perhaps their biggest musical influence, especially in the early portion of the Beatles' career, until Dylan, of course, warped their mind in the mid-60s. But, so I guess if you've influenced Elvis and the Beatles, you've enough said. Right, but he's like literally as influential as really anyone in the history of music can possibly be. You can't be more influential on contemporary music than Little Richard. You know what I mean? You can only be his equal in terms of influence on the modern scene of contemporary rock and roll and all of that. So definitely, a profound impact there. But as well, and perhaps much, much more importantly, really, but truly, truly underappreciated in my totally uneducated uneducated opinion on the facts, but really super underappreciated as a really, really important figure to the civil rights movement that was going on in America in the Little Richard era of the 50s and 60s, early 60s and 50s when Little Richard really was in the prominence, but just really as important of a figure for anti-racism and equality as really anybody in that era as well, especially, politicians aside, but in many ways, in all honesty, politicians included, as we all know, political rhetoric can only take you so far, right? And people can say the right things, in public, and then have different feelings behind closed doors and all that. One of the really things that breaks down racial lines and transcends all of that shit is, music, and as well, of course, entertainment and sports and all of those kind of things that really at the core really touch people to their core and kind of, make them question, that hatred and thoughts and feelings in general. And I mean, I guess did it all strictly through his actions and through the expressions of his art and music, really, because to be like a flamboyantly gay black guy in the 1950s South, you really have to rock, and his talent and his music was so great that it really like overcame and conquered racism at its root with a lot of people in, the early 50s. And of course, Little Richard didn't cure racism, but I mean, he made a lot of people, question, the role that African Americans could have in their lives in entertainment. And I'm sure, in all honesty, quite literally did, turn a lot of people, just because, like I said, I mean, like, there's really nothing that can get inside your heart and change your mind and change just the way you feel about things. In all honesty, more than these things that we really love about life, which are, art and, music and entertainment, and these things, they really do play such a bigger, they really do play such an important, fact in just shaping the way that we naturally feel about things, and just in all honesty, I mean, like, for me, let's say growing up in the suburbs of New Jersey in the 90s, not exactly like huge breeding ground for racism, I suppose, and especially compared to the 50s South, let's say. But I mean, in my life, growing up, you literally couldn't be racist in the 90s in New York City when the coolest people on the world were, Wu-Tang and Lawrence Taylor, and literally all of the posters on my wall as a child were, Michael Jordan and Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg, huge Snoop Dogg guy. I was like an 11-year-old. Literally the only white person in my life as a child was Hulk Hogan, and like the assholes on TGIF were the only, of course, Urkel aside, Family Matters aside, of course, but literally, you just grow up with, entertainment, especially sports, in a lot of ways for me anyway, but like you really can't be racist if you grow up a huge sports fan, you know what I mean? It's just really, you're just going to be rooting for John Stockton to throw bounce passes all day, rooting for offensive linemen and place kickers. No, if you're you grow up a big sports fan, you really just it kind of quells those feelings at its root, because your whole life you're so wrapped up with the sports emotions with these people, and I guess a lot of that changes after the games for a lot of people, as like I said, sports obviously doesn't cure racism, but I mean during the game, nobody is racist while the game is going on anyway, and I guess the same thing is true for Little Richards, as it was literally impossible to hate black people when Little Richard was on the box, And, that really does go a lot of ways. And, of course, Jackie Robinson is, so widely looked at as a great civil rights hero for his, crossing the racial line in sports. But Little Richard, musicians were dealing with all of those exact same things. However, kind of looking back in history, they don't get the credit as Jackie Robinson and some of the early athletes do for being great civil rights heroes. And I guess a lot of that is because, just the whole Negro Leagues is a very upfront and in-your-face display of racism. Well, there was never a quote, there was black clubs that would only play that, only find those artists or whatnot, but it was not as, looking back in history, it's not as easily labeled as it was in sports in a lot of ways. But, equally important and equally as difficult as we all, of course, saw Green Book, but that's literally, the life of Little Richard as an aspiring artist. He was literally in the place that Dr. Ali finally tried chicken wings for the first time or whatever, and the place that Viggo Mortensen was really getting down at the end of Green Book. But, there was, of course, two separate worlds. And I guess another really huge thing about this as well, another reason why it wasn't necessarily so up in your face with music as it was with sports back in the era, but as well another huge thing that was going down with Little Richard. But this is, of course, in the radio era of music, pre-television, pre-MTV anyway, where you're everybody's getting their music via the radio, all right? And in this era, it literally blew white people's minds that Little Richard was even a black guy, right? As these stupid red staters could not even possibly come to grips with the fact that Little Richard and John Lee Hooker and Chuck Berry and some of these people that they've grown to love the music of through the radio, they couldn't even comprehend the fact that they were black. And literally a lot of people learned that by going to see the show for the first time, and they showed up. Imagine you're a staunch racist in Tennessee, in 1950s Tennessee, and you go to see your favorite artist, and Little Richard walks up on stage. It was a total mindfuck, and absolutely a great way to fight racism head on, And there's actually a great, a book which I'm not going to pretend to have read, but I know the story very well, of Daryl Davis, who was a musician of this era, all right, I believe a drummer, but played with all of these in the same, high-end African-American music circuit of the 50s, all right, and then he went on to have this amazing story where he, became on to make a career pretty much out of converting Klansmen, all right, and it all started in this era when these Klansmen would show up and not believe that Little Richard or these guys were black, and Daryl Davis would have to he literally started this because a Klansman came up to him after a show in the 50s and was so amazed at how well he played the piano and said you play it almost as good as Little Richard. How could a black guy possibly play the piano as good as Little Richard? And Daryl Davis was dude, Little Richard's black, and the guy didn't believe him, so he actually took him to go meet, I don't know if it was Little Richard or Chuck Berry or one of the guys of the era, but literally he had to go take the guy to meet him. And that guy literally, hung up the hood. He, hung up the hood and, literally quit the Klan because what do I believe in more, white power or Little Richard? I mean, and clearly the answer is Little Richard in the 1950s, so just really, definitely a great story. Look up, that's the story of Daryl Davis, of course, who's the Klan converter, but so Little Richard, not, a civil rights activist through such measures as that. That, however, like I mentioned, through the action of his music alone, given the time and the era, like I said, to have the bravery to go out there and just be to be Little Richard at the time was really just civil rights heroics in action. And like I mentioned, he does not get, in my very uneducated opinion about civil rights. Like I mentioned, for all I know, he's got like a huge wing in the Civil Rights Museum in Louisville or wherever. But again, just through my sheer ignorance, not racism either. Just because I'm an ignorant asshole doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a racist, which I'm not. Racist, however, am stupid, so could be totally wrong on his respect on the subject, given in the subject. However, I guess you can't have enough respect for Little Richard as a civil rights pioneer, as well a rock and roll originator, innovator, and architect of. So, I guess a huge R.I.P. to Little Richard.
Big F! W-E-F-U-N-K. We Funk.